The morning of the 6th of December 1917 began the way most mornings begin in a harbor town at war. Cold, gray, purposeful. Dock workers moved along the piers of Halifax, Nova Scotia, their breath clouding in the December air. Ferries crossed the Narrows. A school bell rang somewhere in the Richmond district, pulling children through frost-stiffened doors. Mothers stood at kitchen windows, watching the harbor, the way Port Town mothers always do, half habit, half prayer. Nobody looked at the water and saw what was coming, because what was coming did not look like death. It looked like two ships, moving slowly toward each other in the gray morning light. And by the time anyone understood what that meant, the world as Halifax knew it had approximately 4 minutes left. The Halifax explosion of the 6th of December 1917 remains the largest man-made explosion in recorded history prior to the detonation of nuclear weapons. The blast killed an estimated 1,782 people outright. Nearly 9,000 more were injured. Approximately 325 acres of the city, almost the entire Richmond district, was instantaneously flattened. The pressure wave shattered windows as far as 50 miles away, and roughly 9,000 people were left blinded, temporarily or permanently, simply because they were standing at their windows, watching the harbor when the light came. Not a bomb dropped from the sky, not an act of military aggression, not an earthquake rising from below. Two ships, a miscommunication, a harbor full of protocol that nobody followed, and a city that never saw it coming. To understand how Halifax died that morning, you have to understand what Halifax was in 1917. The city was not simply a Canadian port. It was the eastern gateway of the Allied war effort, the staging point through which troops, munitions, food, and supplies flowed from North America toward the bleeding Western Front in Europe. The harbor was always full. The Narrows, the narrow channel connecting the inner Bedford Basin to the outer harbor, was one of the busiest stretches of water in the world at that moment in history. And like every system stretched past its design limits, it had started to fray. The ship that would end Halifax was called the SS Mont-Blanc. She was a French cargo vessel, 320 feet long, registered to the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique. On the evening of December 5th, she arrived at the outer approaches of Halifax Harbor, riding low in the water, dangerously, conspicuously low, because the Mont-Blanc was not carrying food or troops. She was carrying 2,653 tons of picric acid, a highly explosive compound used in artillery shells. She carried 200 tons of TNT. She carried 35 tons of high-octane benzol in drums lashed to her deck. And beneath all of that, filling her holds to capacity, 10 tons of gun cotton. The Mont-Blanc was, in the most literal sense, a floating bomb, the most densely packed explosive device ever assembled in the history of maritime commerce up to that point. Her captain, Aimé Le Medec, knew exactly what he was carrying. His crew knew. The ship flew no red warning flag, the international maritime signal for a vessel carrying explosives. The reason, recorded in the subsequent inquiry, was that Le Medec feared flying such a flag through waters where German U-boats were known to operate would make the Mont-Blanc a priority target. The flag that would have warned Halifax was the same flag that might have killed his crew, so the flag stayed down, and the Mont-Blanc sailed into the Narrows, invisible for what she truly was. That night, she anchored outside the anti-submarine net that guarded the harbor entrance, waiting for morning passage clearance. She was granted access the following morning. She entered the Narrows at approximately 7:30 a.m. on December 6th. Moving in the opposite direction, outbound toward the open Atlantic, was the SS Emo, a Norwegian vessel chartered as a Belgian relief ship, carrying no cargo that morning, riding high and empty in the water. Her high, empty hull made her faster than loaded vessels. She was running behind schedule, which meant her pilot Francis Mackey was pushing her harder than normal. She was traveling, witnesses would later estimate, at somewhere between 7 and 9 knots, through a channel where the standard speed was closer to 5. The Narrows is roughly 800 yards wide at its narrowest navigable point. Maritime rules in Halifax Harbor required outbound vessels to keep to the Dartmouth side, the eastern channel. Inbound vessels kept to the Halifax side. The Mont-Blanc, inbound, was on her correct side, The Emo was not. The Emo had already made 2 irregular course changes that morning, exchanging whistle signals with 2 other vessels and passing them on the wrong side, establishing, in those first quiet morning minutes, a pattern of casual procedural drift that nobody stopped. Nobody challenged, nobody reported. When the Mont-Blanc and the Emo first sighted each other in the Narrows, they were approximately half a mile apart. Both pilots signaled their intentions by whistle. Both interpreted the other's signals differently. The Emo signaled twice, meaning she intended to pass on the left, which was the wrong side for her direction of travel. The Mont-Blanc's pilot, Francis Mackey, signaled once, meaning he expected the standard starboard pass. There was confusion. Then signals changed. Then there was a catastrophic final sequence of commands as both captains threw their engines into reverse and tried to steer away simultaneously. The Emo's bow struck the Mont-Blanc on her starboard side, forward of the bridge, at approximately 8:45 a.m. The collision itself was almost gentle by maritime standards. The 2 ships ground against each other at low speed, the Emo's prow scraping along the Mont-Blanc's hull for several seconds before pulling free. But the grinding metal had done something invisible and irreversible. It had ruptured the drums of benzol lashed to the Mont-Blanc's deck. The highly flammable liquid began pouring across the metal. Sparks from the friction of steel on steel followed a moment later, and the benzol caught. Fire bloomed across the Mont-Blanc's forward deck, fed by aviation-grade fuel, rising fast and fierce and burning in multiple colors, black from the benzol smoke, orange at the core, and at its edges, a strange, vivid green from the chemical compounds being consumed. People on the Halifax shore and on nearby vessels stopped what they were doing and watched. The Mont-Blanc was drifting now, current and her own reversed momentum pushing her back toward the Halifax pier, toward Pier 6 at the foot of the Richmond district. Her crew had abandoned ship within 2 minutes of the fire starting. They had rowed for the Dartmouth shore and were running for high ground. They knew. They knew exactly what was in those holds, what the fire was working its way toward. They were screaming warnings in French at the shore, and the shore did not understand them. On the Halifax waterfront, people were not running. They were watching. A burning ship in harbor was unusual, spectacular even. Ferry passengers pressed against the rails. Children pointed from windows. Factory workers paused on loading docks. Dozens of people in the Richmond district, among the most densely populated areas of Halifax, a neighborhood of working-class families, dock workers, railway employees, and their children gathered at their windows and at the shoreline to see the burning ship more clearly. The Halifax Fire Department dispatched Engine Company No. 4, one of the city's new motor-driven fire trucks, to Pier 6. The firefighters arrived, connected their hoses to a hydrant, and were preparing to advance on the blaze when the Mont-Blanc touched the dock. It was approximately 9:04 a.m. They thought the worst was over, but the true nightmare was just beginning. What happened in the next 30 seconds has been described by physicists, historians, and survivors in language that consistently fails to contain it. The fire had reached the picric acid in the Mont-Blanc's forward hold. The picric acid detonated. Its detonation compressed and ignited the TNT. The TNT detonated, and in a fraction of a second that no human nervous system can meaningfully process, 2,653 tons of the most powerful, non-nuclear explosive material ever assembled in one location released its entire stored energy simultaneously. The pressure wave expanded outward from the Mont-Blanc at a velocity exceeding the speed of sound. The ship itself, 320 feet of steel, engines, decking, and cargo, ceased to exist. The anchor shank, weighing 1,140 pounds, was later found 2.4 miles away from the point of detonation. Pieces of the hull were scattered across both sides of the Narrows. The gun barrel from one of the Mont-Blanc's deck guns landed 3.5 miles from the blast. The water in the Narrows was physically displaced outward by the explosion, forming a brief but massive tsunami-like wave, a wall of water that struck the shores of both Halifax and Dartmouth, and pulled back, depositing debris hundreds of feet inland, before retreating and leaving a mudflat where the harbor floor had been momentarily exposed. The pressure wave hit the Richmond district at the same instant that the thermal pulse, a flash of heat, moving at the speed of light, passed through every window in its path. Glass was not simply broken, it was converted into high-velocity shrapnel. Every person standing at a window in the northern Halifax districts watching the burning ship, drawn there by curiosity, drawn there by the spectacle of fire, was hit. The pattern of eye injuries alone told the story of how many people had been watching. Surgeons at the Victoria General Hospital that morning performed more eye operations than the hospital had conducted in any previous year. Many patients arrived having felt nothing. The pressure wave was too fast for pain to register immediately. They reported only that they had been looking at the harbor, and then the world went white. The Narrows area north of the explosion, specifically the Richmond district, was not damaged. The Richmond district was gone. The distinction matters. Damage implies something that remains, something bent or broken that retains its shape. What the blast pressure and the subsequent fire did to Richmond was more absolute than damage. The wooden frame houses of the working-class neighborhood, hundreds of them, packed tightly up the hill from Pier 6, were converted into airborne debris in under 1 second. The structural integrity of every building within a half-mile radius was eliminated instantly. Walls became projectiles. Roofs became projectiles. The people inside those buildings had no time to move, no warning, no possible protective action. The school in the Richmond district, Hillis and Sons, and the nearby Richmond School had just opened for the morning. Children were at their desks. Their teachers were at the front of classrooms. The buildings ceased to be buildings at 9 hours, 4 minutes, and 35 seconds a.m., and the children inside them became part of the toll that the official inquiry would spend months trying to count. In her final dispatch before communications failed across the northern Halifax grid, one telegraph operator, Vince Coleman, a train dispatcher working at the Richmond Railway yards, had received warning from a colleague that the burning ship was a munitions carrier. Coleman's yards contained trains with passengers already aboard, and more trains incoming along the Intercolonial Railway. He sent a message. He sent it over the telegraph. The words transmitted in the 30 seconds or so before the explosion reached him. The message read, in the account preserved by railway historians, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire and harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." Coleman stayed at his post. The train stopped. Hundreds of incoming passengers were spared. Vince Coleman did not survive. The captain of the Mont-Blanc, Aimé Le Medec, survived. He had gone over the side with his crew, rowing hard for the Dartmouth shore, running up the embankment before the explosion. He was alive. He was unhurt. He was arrested the following day, along with pilot Francis Mackey, charged with manslaughter. The subsequent legal proceedings, one of the most complex and acrimonious disaster inquiries in Canadian history, would drag through the courts for years, ultimately producing no permanent convictions. Mackey's pilot license was temporarily suspended and then reinstated. Le Medec returned to sea. The Emo, the Norwegian vessel whose collision had started the fire, was driven aground on the Dartmouth shore by the tsunami wave generated by the explosion. Her captain and pilot had been killed by the blast. She was refloated, repaired, and returned to service under a different name. The fires that followed the initial explosion burned through the ruins of Richmond for hours. The ruins were, in many cases, also the location of survivors, people trapped under collapsed structures, injured, disoriented, calling out into a landscape that no longer resembled anything they had known. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, hampered by the destruction of transportation infrastructure, the severing of water mains, and the sheer scale of the debris field. The Halifax fire station had lost its entire engine company number 4. The firefighters who had been preparing to battle the ship fire were found in the rubble of Pier 6. That night, a blizzard arrived, a full northeastern winter storm, bringing heavy snow and plummeting temperatures, descended on a city that had lost 25,000 of its roughly 50,000 residents their homes. The injured were being treated in any structure, still standing churches, the railway station, Dalhousie University's buildings, private homes. Surgeons worked by lantern light where electricity had failed. The storm continued through December 7th and into December 8th, burying the ruins of Richmond under 1.5 feet of snow, and making recovery of those still trapped beneath the debris catastrophically more difficult. Aid began arriving within hours of the explosion. The city of Boston, Massachusetts dispatched a relief train carrying medical personnel, supplies, and money within 24 hours, a response so rapid and so generous that Nova Scotia annually sends a large Christmas tree to Boston Common to this day, a tradition that has continued for more than 50 years as a formal acknowledgement of that act of solidarity in the worst hours of December 1917. The final count of the dead settled, across multiple inquiries and reconciled census records, at approximately 1,782 killed outright. Some estimates place the true toll higher, accounting for deaths in the weeks following from injuries and exposure during the blizzard. Approximately 9,000 people sustained injuries of varying severity. Roughly 6,000 people were left homeless immediately. The physical destruction covered an area of nearly 400 acres on the Halifax side alone. The Richmond district was rebuilt over the following years, but the community that had existed there, the particular web of families, the dock workers and their children, the schools and the churches, and the street corner rhythms of a working harbor neighborhood, that community did not return. Communities do not return from that kind of arithmetic. The legal question of culpability was eventually redirected, in the public imagination and in much of the historical literature, toward the systemic failures that the collision exposed, rather than toward the individual pilots and captains who were its immediate actors. The harbor of Halifax in December 1917 operated under a patchwork of wartime regulations, civilian port authority rules, Royal Canadian Navy oversight, and International Maritime Convention, a layered bureaucratic structure in which lines of authority and responsibility were, at critical moments, unclear to almost everyone operating within them. The Mont-Blanc entered Halifax without a proper explosives warning flag for reasons that were tactically understandable and procedurally catastrophic. The EMO made irregular course corrections through the Narrows that morning without being challenged by any harbor authority vessel. The collision itself lasted long enough, 20 minutes of converging trajectories, that multiple parties had time to intervene and did not. Not because they were malicious, because the system had no clear protocol for exactly this situation, because wartime pressure had normalized risk, because a harbor handling more traffic than it was designed for had started treating its own near misses as background noise. This is what the Halifax explosion teaches, and it is a lesson that infrastructure investigators and disaster researchers have cited in the decades since. Catastrophic failure rarely arrives without warning. It arrives at the end of a chain of small compromises, each one individually defensible, each one imperceptibly bending the margin of safety until the margin is gone. The Mont-Blanc was not an anomaly in Halifax Harbor in 1917. Ships carrying explosives had been moving through the Narrows regularly for months. The procedures that governed their passage had been repeatedly stretched and informally modified without formal review. The system had been working, and systems that work while accumulating unacknowledged risk do not send warning signals. They send silence. The silence ends at 9:04 a.m. The rebuilding of Halifax's Richmond district began almost immediately and proceeded throughout 1918 and into the early 1920s. The new houses were planned by a commission that included contributions from noted architects, and the rebuilt neighborhood was, in its physical form, arguably better constructed than what it replaced. The trauma of the survivors, the blinded, the bereaved, the thousands who had been inside the destruction radius and come out the other side with injuries that 1917 medicine could only partially address, that was not rebuilt. That simply continued. There is a museum in Halifax today, situated at the former site of the Halifax explosion at Pier 21. The artifacts recovered from the ruins of the Mont-Blanc and from the rubble of Richmond are documented. The telegraph dispatch of Vince Coleman is preserved. The clock found in the ruins of the Richmond post office is preserved. Its hands stopped at 9:05 a.m., 1 minute after the explosion, the exact moment the concussion wave reached the building and ended everything inside it, including time itself, as far as that clock was concerned. Every year, on December 6th, The city of Halifax observes a moment of silence at 9:04 a.m. The harbor is still there. The Narrows is still there. Ships still move through it, though the traffic is different now, and the regulations governing the movement of hazardous cargo through restricted waterways have been revised repeatedly in the centuries since that morning. Whether they have been revised enough, whether any revision is ever enough, when the variable you cannot regulate is the human tendency to let routine absorb danger, is a question that every port city on Earth is still, in one form or another, living inside. The Mont-Blanc left almost nothing. A few pieces of hull plating, an anchor shank in a field 2.5 miles from where she died. A name in the records. She was just a ship. She was the wrong ship in the wrong harbor on a morning when every system designed to prevent catastrophe failed quietly, politely, and completely. And then Halifax was gone. The snow that fell the night of December 6th covered the ruins by morning. And for a few hours, if you did not look too closely, if you stood at the right distance and let the white smooth everything out, the city almost looked like it was simply sleeping. It was not sleeping. It was counting its dead in the dark.